My analogy here is that the neural pathways, if you think of them as a forest that has not been walked through for a number of times, then you might step very gently because you don't know if there's something sharp that you're going to step on. And eventually you do that path a number of times to where you don't even have to think of it. It's like the conscious, unconscious competence feedback loop, right?
Welcome back, everyone, to the Smarter Not Harder podcast. Today, I'm hosting again. It's Boomer Anderson, and we're going to dive into the world of movement, but a little bit more than just movement here, specifically getting into awareness shift. We're getting into recovery, what that looks like, and how to do all of this in a very time-constrained way. My guest today is Josh Holland, who's been a longtime friend and someone who I bounce movement questions off of all the time. And today we get into areas that I just mentioned, diving deep into recovery and why the recovery might equal the stimulus. We get into that idea of conscious connection and feedback loops and how to use those feedback loops both within your patients and clients and yourselves to generate better health optimization outcomes. And of course, we talk about movement and what it's like for Josh to work with clients like Roger Waters, Oscar Isaac, and Madonna to really optimize their health through movement and other things over the course of a very time-constrained schedule. If you want to, of course, follow more of this stuff, more of this smarter, not harder type living, please smash that like button on your YouTube area. Please click subscribe, and we're going to be out with episodes every single week and doing topics like decision-making, movement in this case, nutrition, and so many more. You can find out more about Josh if you're interested in this episode at Joshua J. Holland on every social media channel. And let's get to my conversation with my good friend, Josh Holland. All right, we're back, and it's another episode of the Smarter Not Harder podcast where I get to interview all kinds of experts in fields like decision-making, nutrition. I get to talk about sometimes complex adaptive systems, all these crazy things. And today we're going to get in the world of movement. And I have my dear friend here. It's been a while since I've seen you, buddy. Was it Amsterdam the last time I saw you? I don't know.
That's right.
Well, Amsterdam in person. And since then, I've moved countries. You've traveled the world and the 7 seas, and we're here together today. Mr. Josh Holland, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm excited to finally get this going. I know we've been discussing doing this at some point previously, and here we are.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah. And I think I owe you an apology because it's taken so long, but we're going to get it done, and we're going to do it in a fun fashion. So today I briefed Josh just a bit before this call to talk a little bit about movement, and we're going to talk specifically about movement in that time constraint. And just to give those who may be unfamiliar with Josh's work a little bit of background here, Josh, you work with some pretty famous people, and Oscar Isaac, Madonna, Roger Waters, just to name a few, right? And everybody here has probably heard of at least one of those characters. And one of the things that before we dive into that time-constrained movement, let's get into how you got into movement in the first place, because I think this is a fascinating story about a guy from, I still can't believe you're from Oklahoma, martial artist, dancer, basketball player. Josh Holland, give us the tour de force that brought you to training.
Ooh, okay. Great setup, because as you pointed out, I think it is important to understand where we come from to then understand where we're going. And so it's all about awareness through all of that. And I use my background in movement to bring me back to square one. So I'm a big proponent of the movement milestone or movement milestones. And part of my movement milestone goes from me being an infant, learning to turn over and then lie down and crawl and then stand up and stroll or cruise, as they call it, walk, and then eventually run and jump and do all these things. After that set of movement milestones for me, I was born into martial arts. So I started martial arts when I was 4 years old. And a lot of people may wonder, wow, 4 years old, like how much martial arts can you really take in at that point? But it was less about the knowledge and more about the experience, because we, as a human species, we adapt to what we see, right? So how our parents walk, the people that we're around the most, how they walk, how they talk, how they move, what they eat, all of that is ingrained in us from a very young age. Our formative years allow us to ingrain that into ourselves. And then if that's a beneficial ingrainment, then we can take that to the next level. And so I got my black belt when I was 12 years old, just before I turned 12. And to give you a little bit of a backstory, even deeper, in my martial arts upbringing, it was my father's martial arts school. It's a karate school called Russell School of Karate. And that was a blended style, which at the time was one of the first, at least in Oklahoma, blended styles. Because at that time, so I'm 43 years old now, and so I was born in 81. So around 1985, there would have been a handful of martial arts studios in the region, but most of them were focused on one style, whether it be like Taekwondo or so on and so forth. And during that time, it was really popular to find out what was the best style. And then fast forward a few years, and the UFC, sort of in its early infancy, came out. And that was when you got a chance to see on TV
blended style at scale.
Yeah, exactly. Like all these blended styles. But even then, I think the first iteration of the UFC was, okay, let's see what the best style is. And then here comes this group out of Brazil that does Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And that was when everybody's, whoa, wait a minute. You can take a small guy who typically you would think would never win against a huge, strong guy, yet he's choking him out and making it look easy. So people were thinking it was a joke. Anyway, I say all that to say that my dad had this really interesting way of looking at martial arts, because his background himself, he trained in Taekwondo, he trained in Goju-Ryu, he trained in Kenpo, and so many different styles. So when he decided to create his own style, he thought, why not blend it all? Because he was agnostic when it came to martial arts. It's just like, how can we create the best martial artist? And aside from all that, I got a chance to see my mom was very involved in the church, and she also did a bunch of different jobs outside of going to church. My dad was a plumber, a massage therapist, carpenter. He did all these things. And I was like, wow, this is really cool, because I didn't know what the term was at the time, but it was like being an entrepreneur. That was what I knew my dad to be through and through. And so once I got my black belt, which, by the way, it takes many years to get to a black belt level. In fact, in my dad's system, it typically a person will go from a white belt to a yellow belt in 2 to 3 months. Usually 3 months is like the maximum it takes to get from point A to point B in terms of white belt to yellow belt. And it took my brother and I 2 years because my dad was so tough on us. And so he didn't want anyone thinking that just because we're the sons of the sensei that we're being gifted any rank. So I say all that to say is that we had to really prove ourselves, because we didn't want people thinking that we were just given something. So I get my black belt, and then I decided, okay, I want to do what my dad's doing. I want to do any kind of work. I don't want to wait until I graduate high school, then go to college, and then try to get a job like everyone else is asked to do. I decided that I wanted to, I was doing leather work. I was doing woodworking. I was mowing yards, raking leaves, shoveling snow. And most of that was because we grew up relatively poor. So if I wanted anything like basketball shoes, or if I wanted to go on trips like all the other kids got to go on trips, I had to pay for it, like literally myself. And so this is a long-winded answer to tell you that this is what built who I am today, because with all of that, I realized that I do want to work for myself. I appreciate being a leader, but I understand how to be a follower. And this is some of the frameworks that I use in terms of working with some of the people that you mentioned earlier. It's some people stay in their lane, and that's great. And then there's people like myself who have multiple lanes that we can work within, but you can only do that when you have a clear vision of how you want to get there. And then once you get there, how do you maintain that and build upon that? So I think that's what we're going to talk about today, is some of these frameworks.
Yeah. And one of the things, look, I've had the privilege of spending time with you in Amsterdam in person, but also having many of these types of conversations, whether it's in back in the day in Delaware or phone calls, other podcasts, etc. And one of the things that I've always loved about your framework, and it's something I try to do in other aspects of life as well, is you borrow what's needed and leave the stuff that's not necessarily needed there. And I think too many of these disciplines, not necessarily just in fitness, but certainly fitness is an easy one to look at, say like it's powerlifting and nothing else, or it's a certain type of yoga and nothing else. But you tend to borrow from almost all facets of this area called movement. And so I want to dive into that with you, Josh, because there are these high profile people that have no time. And for those listening here, I know there's a lot of people that are clinicians. And if you're running a clinic, you're running any sort of business, or if you're just in general living in this planet, you probably have a time constraint, right? And you're looking at the world and saying, like, how do I get this time to move? But you work with some people that have high demands on their time. Let's break it out for, let's say, any one of them. How do you assess really how to focus them in this journey of movement? Maybe we can start there from the framework of your assessment.
Okay, so it's a very important point that you bring up, because the average person might think, oh, it's easy to work with a celebrity, because at the end of the day, we all know that they're people just like us, just like you and me. However, the most important thing is to understand their time constraints. So they don't have a lot of time to fiddle around, if you will. They don't have time to waste time.
So you're not doing
No one
you're not
does.
doing 3 hours in the gym with them, I guess is what. Okay.
Like I used to do 2 hours with Madonna, but that's because she wanted to do it in a certain way that she was used to. She's someone that is very deliberate on what she wants to do, and she sets the time for it. So that's a difference, right? If she wasn't prepared for a 2-hour session, then it may mess up the rest of her day. So that was what she wanted. Whereas when I work with somebody like Roger, sometimes we do 30 minutes, 45 minutes because of the different levels. And so I like to break apart this idea of creating movement in a 1-hour block that fits a business perspective. These 1-hour blocks is simply for businesses to be able to run and to be able to charge per that. And I've always been a person that says, okay, instead of focusing on you billing me or me billing you for 1 hour of your time, let's just bill for a session. Some days that's going to be 45 minutes. Some days that's going to be 3 hours, depending on what we're doing. And just to scale everything back, when I work with someone like a Roger or a Madonna or an Oscar, I realize that time that they're spending with me is extremely valuable. So that means I need to have some kind of idea in mind when I approach the session. So I usually get there very early. I usually plan out something, but I'm also very fluid with it within that planning, because I never know once one of these people come to a session if maybe they woke up with a sore back. Maybe they woke up with a crick in their neck because they slept wrong. Maybe they were exhausted. They have a hangover from having a fun night out the night before. If my plan for that day was based around crushing them in the gym, then I'm furthering that damage. It's putting them at higher risk for injury, and also just wiping them out for the rest of their day, knowing that they have to communicate and they have to be on point. So my goal is to have them arrive, and then I see where they are once they arrive, and then leave them in a much better situation to go on their day and carry out what they need to carry out. And yes, they might leave exhausted, or they might leave inspired, right? So I guess the idea is I see where they are, understand, okay, how much time do we have today? Because that's important. How are you feeling today? That's important. If you have things like an Oura ring or a Garmin watch or something that can measure HRV, we can look at that and see, because sometimes people will just want to get on with it. But let's just see. And depending on how well I know a person, I can look you in your eyes and tell, are you spazzing out right now? Are you just trying to get on with this session? I can't tell you how many times I've said to a client, hey, you know what? Today we're just going to go for a walk. And they look at me like, yeah, but I I plan time for this session today. Okay, today's session is going to be between the ears, right? Today's session is going to be about elevating you to the next level so that we can come back and crush it tomorrow. And if you really value crushing your session every time we have a session, then I want you to value how well you're sleeping, how well you're eating, and how well you recover.
The second sponsor of this podcast is Health Optimization Medicine in Practice. Health Optimization Medicine in Practice is our 501c3 nonprofit, which I'm the proud CEO of, and we teach doctors and non-doctor healthcare practitioners how to optimize health rather than treat disease. The core analytical framework for that is clinical metabolomics. Metabolomics is simply the analysis of your cells, where they are now and where they have been over the past several weeks. And we're able to determine with that what our clients need in terms of supplementation, and perhaps even are there heavy metal toxicities that need to be addressed. We're conducting our next clinical metabolomics cohort in Q3 or September. It's precisely the week of September 9th, 2024. And if you want to join that, head on over to homehope.org and use the code podcast10, because you're going to join that cohort where you're quickly going to find 20, yes, we cap that class at 20 of your best friends to learn clinical pearls from experts like Dr. Ted Achacoso, Jody Duvall, Dr. Scott Schur, and yours truly, who host this show all out of love, but also donate all of our time to Health Optimization Medicine in Practice. Let's get back to the show.
That's what's going to determine what we do. Because at the end of the day, no matter how famous a person is or how much money they're paying me, I'm willing to always accept and tell them that I may not be the trainer for you. And that is very powerful, especially with people at that level, because a lot of them don't want to be told no.
Yeah.
Once they bring you into their world, they don't want to be told no. They don't want to be told that I have to go and work with someone else, or that, listen, we can't do it today because you're not performing properly. Like, we have to be willing to get rid of this idea of staying in this box for this period of time with this person. So I don't know if that answers the question necessarily. We can dive into it more, but the framework for me is very simple in that it becomes intuitive. It doesn't happen the first day, doesn't happen overnight, but eventually it's very intuitive. It's always the feeling of, how is this person being received? What is their aura, which is a very explanation, but what are you receiving when this person comes into the room?
So Josh, I know you have a lot of data points on your clients, and these are qualitative and quantitative, as you mentioned, which allows you to, these are people that you've worked with for years, and in certain cases, probably decades, where you just know intuitively they walk in and you see it in their eyes. And I want to come back to the eyes here in a second. But first, there are a few points that you mentioned there around recovery, food, and I believe stress. And what I want to suss out here is it sounds like the recovery equals the stimulus in certain ways. Talk us through what a good recovery for somebody looks like in order for you to, let's say, maximize the stimulus on the other end.
Great question. So I'll just do a very shameless plug here. Okay. This is my book called The Awareness Shift.
I've read it.
Which, by the way, Dr. Ted did the foreword on it, which is pretty cool. In that book, I lay out my 5 pillars for optimal health and wellness. And that's a good framework for what I do. So this book was written to lay out what it is I do, because a lot of people were like, Josh, but you're a trainer, but you're a health coach, you're doing all these things. And so what I wanted to identify was 5 major things.
First off, have you ever just said, I'm the Renaissance man? That's okay. It's okay to say that, because oftentimes, and it sounds cocky or something, but I do think that there are people like yourselves where you're asked by your parents, hey, what do you do? And you're like, I'm the Renaissance man, right?
Yeah, I certainly have played around with that term, but it just didn't sit well with me from that like overconfidence and cocky perspective. However, I do relate to it quite a bit. And I find it fascinating, and it's what keeps me very curious. I'm a very curious being, and that curiosity allows me to explore. So it goes back to the point you brought up earlier, in which, especially like in fitness, most people want to find the one thing and that's all they do. But from a very young age, I was always open to many things. And so I accept what feels right, and then I discard what doesn't. And so that's the basis. But the 5 pillars of optimal health and wellness, what I identified throughout my decades of doing this. So I've been at this level for about 20 years. And what I identified was 5 key things. And each of the pillars have a qualitative aspect to it, which is quality, right? So it's quality awareness is pillar number 1, which I find to be the most important. And the reason for that is if we're not aware of what we need to do, what we can do, what we should do, then why are we even talking about it? Like, why are you as a client, not you, Boomer, why is a client sitting in front of me? Why did you pick up the phone to reach out to me? Is it because I work with other celebrities and you find yourself, you think you're a celebrity and you think you've got the money to say that you have a trainer that's a cool dude? If that's the case, cool. But let's call the kettle black, right? Let's actually mention that, and then we can expand upon that. We can make that such that you get what you need and I'm able to get what I need and we can all win, right? Pillar number 2, which I believe to be the next most important, I used to think it was the most important, is quality recovery, which is that point you're talking about, right? And within that umbrella is sleep, de-stressing, monitoring your HRV, if that means anything to you, heart rate variability, right? And so all of that goes into that recovery piece, because if you're able to do these pillars properly, from pillar 5 down to 1, if you're able to do it properly, then it creates this beautiful cycle that has a lot of balance, which ultimately optimizes your overall health and wellness. And so to not leave people hanging, I'll mention the other 3 pillars. So pillar 1 is quality awareness. Pillar 2 is quality rest. Pillar number 3 is quality consumption. Pillar number 4 is quality activeness. And pillar number 5 is quality exercise. And what's always interesting, especially when people know me as a fitness trainer, they always think, oh, number 1 is the most important, right? Because it's number 1. But I say, actually, if you're doing 5 through 4 or 5 through 2, then 1 becomes icing on the cake. 1 becomes the easy piece. And so there is a difference between exercise and activeness.
Yeah, I was going to ask. Those 2 sound very similar. And so let's differentiate those.
That I love to do, okay? Because there is like a triage effect. The awareness is something that we can do more than anything else. We can. It's not to say that we do or we need to do, but we can be aware more than probably all the other pillars. The next thing that should take up the bulk of our time is this quality rest component. We should be focusing on getting good sleep, which some people will say anywhere from 6 to 8 hours, 6 to 9 hours, whatever is good for you. But that's what we can do more than focusing on our food. So quality consumption is much greater probably than what we can be active doing. I guess we could be active for quite a bit. But the difference between activeness and exercise is, what I write in the book is that quality activeness is something that you don't have to focus on changing your gear. You don't have to put on the right kind of shirt and shorts and shoes to be active. And so I know that's a very crude explanation, but something like walking to the store instead of getting in a car. We know these things, right?
Josh, let's double click on activeness here, because I think in many ways, if you're a business owner listening to this and you're saying you only have a certain amount of time per day, and we'll get to the other pillars, of course, in a moment, are there benchmarks that you give people in terms of activeness? Because in a day and age where I know I sit in a chair quite a bit, right? And I have a standing desk too, and I'll alternate it. But what are the sort of benchmarks that you're looking for people?
Okay, now this is really good. So thank you for asking the question, because it helps to break down how I think about this. When it comes to certain people, I have to meet them where they're at. Some people, especially the type A personalities out there, they need a detailed list of what's going to be happening, right? They need benchmarks. So Roger Waters is someone like that. He wants to have a sheet that where he can wake up and know, okay, this is what I'm going to do today, or this is what I'm doing every day, and I check off the box, right? He will do that until I tell him otherwise. So with a person like that, we need benchmarks. We need goals. We achieve those goals, and we move on from those goals. But then there's other people like Oscar, for instance, who he's most likely only going to respond when he has a movie that he's shooting in which he needs to be fit and needs to look a certain way. I try to meet him where he's at. And so he might be a person I'll say to him, I'll write him out a program, but chances are He might do that program one time because he's so busy. He does need the structure, but he needs me there to take him through it.
Mm-hmm.
So benchmarks for him is a lot different than a benchmark for Roger. And then Madonna, her benchmark is basically, we're going to show up every day. We're going to train for about 90 minutes. And I'm going to leave it up to you to make the program for the week. I'll approve of that program. If the program's good, then we do that for the next few days. And then the next week, we do a whole different program. And it's usually based around dancing and music and all these things. And so benchmarks for me, I have to be very careful because it can turn someone off or it can turn someone on. And so I have to identify who that works for. But some of the basic benchmarks, just to answer the question fully, some of the basic benchmarks is, did you meet 10,000 steps? I know it's just an arbitrary number that's just out there, but it is a benchmark that we can say, okay, if you live in a city like LA, chances are you're probably driving everywhere. So you may need to focus on getting to that benchmark by going outside and getting creative. If you live in a city like New York City, like I live, then it's probably easy because it's a hassle to be driving everywhere, right? And parking and whatnot. So it's easier to say to someone here, okay, hit 15,000 steps, and then anything beyond that is just extra. Beautiful. And I also like to do it in very achievable chunks. So somebody might think, okay, Josh, I want a 4-week program, which I already have ready to copy and paste and send to them, but I'll send it to them 1 week at a time because I want to see just how honest you're going to be about doing it. Because I'll know based on giving you the next week's program, if you actually achieved all the things you needed to do in week 1. Mm-hmm. And so that's another level of being able to know who your client is, know who you're working with. It's, as an employer, knowing who your employees are. Are you going to put them in a role that they benefit and they can maximize their potential the most? Or are you going to try to challenge them and put them in a role that maybe doesn't quite fit them? And then you're always having to go back and forth and judge them on their performance and blah, blah, blah. So with me, I like to make sure that we're going to get the most out of this person when they're not with me. Mm-hmm. And then when I see them, I can usually say, okay, if I gave them a week of mobility exercises and then I come and reassess them and I see that they're still at the level that they were at, either they really need to work on it more, which would be the next program, mm-hmm. or they didn't do it. Yeah. And so I get a chance to find out, can you be honest with me and tell me, did you do it? Because if you did do it, then we really have a lot more to focus on. And I got to go back to the drawing board and give you something that you can work mm-hmm. through. If you didn't do it, then why? That's a great conversation. Why didn't you do it? Didn't have time. I was too busy. And that's where I get a chance to really discover who this person is. Because if you're too busy to go out and take a postprandial walk after eating a meal, if you don't have enough time, then maybe you should reconsider how many meals you eat throughout the mm-hmm. day.
Yeah.
Right? Because if the goal is every time you eat a meal, you go for a 10-minute walk, then, okay, if you have to work, can you take a call from the outside? Or do you have a standing desk or a treadmill that you can move on while you're taking calls? If not, then, okay, maybe skip a meal. Mm-hmm. It's not going to kill you. In fact, there's a lot of research to say that intermittent fasting is very beneficial for mm-hmm. us. So that's how I see it. It's not your typical, like, I don't come at any of this with this idea of I got to keep a client, so I got to give them what they want. I'm in this business of I'm trying to help everyone I work with optimize their overall health and wellness. And however that looks, it may be movement, it may be meditation, it may be psychedelics, it might be a whole host of things. Yeah, that's how I see it.
What I want to draw attention to here is the questions that you're asking, because I think one of the things that I've taken away in our conversations over the years are those questions, because you're approaching everybody as an individual. And for the practitioners listening to this that have very general programs and they want to force people through that, I have no problem with that. But there's a different approach that's much more bespoke, and you're only working with a person one-on-one at any given time. It's not that you're seeing one to group. And so for those listening to this who are looking for like very specific benchmarks, just acknowledge that there's a different way of doing things, but also as you're working with your clients' perhaps some of these questions that Josh just highlighted here around, okay, why didn't you do something? Okay, what's the answer to that question? Oftentimes will point you in a different direction of where you need to focus your attention, whether it's in taking supplements or in movement. Now, Josh, because I just said movement, the thing that everybody wants to know when talking to you is you have somebody who wants 30 minutes of movement and they need to look good because they're a celebrity and they only have 30 minutes to move during a day. And I'm going to come back. Don't worry. I'm going to come back to recovery and awareness too, because those are two very cool topics. But on the movement side of things, the tools that you use to get somebody adequate movement in minimal time, can you go through some of those tools and just the ones that you found to be the most successful? Let me let you guys in on a little secret. Way back when we were launching Transcriptions, this is 2020, Josh Holland was one of the first influencers to actually use our product, and he used it without telling us. And he once sent a message on Instagram saying how much he loved Blue Carnitine. And so if you're looking for 4 to 6 hours of unrelenting, awesome focus, check out Blue Carnitine. You can check it out on transcriptions.com. You can use the code POD10 and it'll get you 10% off. And just know that Josh has used this many, many times. And it's something that I myself use once or twice a week to get that strategic focus, to get the things I need to get done fast and really on time. So let's get back to the episode.
Yes. Okay. So one of the easy ones to highlight is a vibration plate or a vibration platform. And what I like about a vibration platform is that we can get these micro movements that our body desires, that our body craves. We can get those micro movements with a certain type of vibration platform. Now, you don't have to necessarily go out and buy one. You can jump rope, you can bounce up and down, you can get a trampoline, you can get all those bits of vibration. But what we're really looking for, and what I like to try to highlight with that, is it's a good way to get movement, micro movements, with a very small footprint, minimal amount of time. You can do it for 10 minutes. Usually some of these are programmed at around 10 minutes. You can set the frequency, whatever you want. And so you can do that, or you can do it the most natural way, which is just bouncing, right? Just literally bounce up and down. Like, it's one of the things I do before I go for a run. And how much time did that take? I can be watching a TV show, or I can be talking with someone. They might think I'm crazy, but I can just bounce up and down. I do it every day after I do my cold plunge. I have this amazing cold plunge in my apartment now. And so when I get out of it, I'm freezing cold and I just bounce up and down for a little bit. So that's movement. And what I want people to understand is that movement should not be considered exercise. And I think that's the thing that people get hung up on, is that, oh, but that's not exercise. Remember, it's quality activeness is what we're looking for. So we're trying to get active, right? One of those is a vibration plate. Very simple thing I think everyone should have, or some form of vibration. And the benefits beyond just getting the micro movements is also bone density. So we can really affect bone density depending on how often you use it and you know what you do with it. When we get into these older populations, we really need to focus on bone density, especially for the older female population. So we
shout out to my mom right now, by the way.
Yeah,
with osteopenia. So okay, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. So that's one good tool. Okay. Another really good tool is a flow rope or rope flow. And what I love about rope flow is that depending on how you use it,
so
again,
we're talking like battle ropes or inertia wave. What are we talking about here?
Those are all good tools, but think of a rope flow or flow rope as a thick jump rope.
Gotcha.
Right? That's an actual rope that is designed to be used other than jumping it as a jump rope. I do like to use it as a jump rope because I do want to get that force reaction throughout the skeleton of the body. But it's designed to be used as a mobility tool. Even more important, I think, than the mobility tool is what it does cognitively. So the more you use the rope, the better your flow gets. So what I'll take a person through is a very simple figure eight. So you do a figure eight with one hand, right? You take the rope, and anybody can go out there and do it. Just take a regular thick rope and just twirl it around, do a figure eight. and then do it with the other hand, and then do it with both hands. Then I would teach you maybe some more complex drills to go through. And then eventually you'll start to create a pattern or flow. And that's one of the ones where I know for a fact, the more a person uses it. So if I'm going to invest in getting you a rope and I say, okay, I'm going to teach you a new move each week for the next 4 weeks. I know without a doubt that you practice it or you didn't, because you'll be ready for that next one. You'll be ready looking online on what are some other cool moves. And what's happening is you're opening up the neural networks in the brain. And my analogy here is that the neural pathways, if you think of them as a forest that has not been walked through for a number of times, then you might step very gently because you don't know if there's something sharp that you're going to step on. And eventually you do that path a number of times to where you don't even have to think of it. It's like the conscious, unconscious competence feedback loop, right? The more you do it, the easier it becomes. And so what I want to do is turn on the brains of the people. You watch them get really frustrated trying to do a move, and then eventually they get it, and you get a chance to celebrate that moment. And you see them, their eyes get brighter, and they take that thing home, and then they want to challenge themselves. And you take a person like Roger, who's extremely competitive with himself. I'm going to get this move down. And then you have some people who are just so natural at it that I can take them into the very complex moves on day one. And so that's a really good tool that I think not enough people talk about, but it's in my bag no matter where I go, because I can do rope flow with it. I can jump rope with it. I can even use it for suspension training. Okay? So vibration plate, some form of a rope, right? A rope flow rope. Another cool one, if we want to talk more tech, is two things we'll talk about is electrical muscle stimulation, EMS.
You've been talking to me about this one for a long time.
Oh, yeah. And I've been a quote unquote expert in the field of EMS for several years, to the point where my company System Fit has now we've designed it years ago, but we are at the breaking point of launching to the public our EMS bodysuit. And just for those who aren't familiar with it, very simply put, it's a suit that has a number of electrodes on all the major muscle groups that basically activate the muscles depending on where you set it, right? Because it has different modes to it: cardio mode, strength training mode, recovery mode. So you can set the different frequencies to activate your muscles for you while you work out. So it's combining voluntary and involuntary muscle activation. That's what we're looking for. And what's really cool about it is it has TENS therapy built into it as well. So if you're a person that has a problem activating your glutes, and therefore that's giving you back pain and hip flexor pain, what I can do is turn on the glutes on this device and all the other major muscle groups as well. But I can really activate those glutes, turn them on. And then sometimes that's all you need to do, right? Then a person's off and going. They feel like, wow, that's what it feels like to activate my glutes. Okay. When you go to a physical therapist and someone's in pain, usually, and not to say that this is a bad thing, but the framework is that you put a person in a certain shape, and then you hope that they're activating the parts of the body that they're supposed to activate to foster a good recovery, right? To get them out of pain. But you don't know, right? Because there's no real feedback other than, do you feel that? Yes. Okay. How deep is that activation? How frequent is that activation? Where we can use EMS is we can pair that with physical therapy. We can pair that with performance training. We can pair that with so many different modalities so that we can get the most. Talk about health optimization. That's optimizing your workout. So this is the kind of stuff that is perfect for someone who doesn't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
So that's one high-tech piece. It's not cheap, but it's something that, depending on how you want to utilize your performance goals and your time in the gym, will depend on if that's worth it for you. And then another piece of tech that kind of goes in that field is the Katsu bands, or the blood flow restriction. I love that Katsu calls it blood flow moderation, because you're not necessarily restricting the blood, but you are moderating the flow. And you get the arterial flow.
So it's not full occlusion, right?
Exactly. It's not full occlusion, but what it does is it allows for arterial flow, so blood can go into the limbs, but it's restricting or moderating the venous return. And what's important about that is that we get a chance to build up nitric oxide. The body wants to open up those blood vessels, dilate those blood vessels, because it thinks there's a problem. There's some kind of blockage at the upper arm or the upper leg. And so the benefits are far ranging, and you don't really need heavy weights to benefit from that.
It's crazy how little you need in order to actually get that kind of benefit there too.
Exactly. So I bring these kind of tools up because these are the perfect tools that you can do at home. You don't have to have a gym membership. I can't tell you how many times people come to me and say, I would have worked out. I don't have a gym anymore since the pandemic or this and that. And I'm like, I don't either. Yeah. Like my whole house, my apartment is set up as a gym. But even if there were no tools, my whole apartment is set up as a gym. Mm-hmm. The world is our gym. So we can get creative if we so want to. And so this goes back to, why are you here in the first place? Because at the end of the day, you don't need me. Yeah. There's how many trainers online, right? How much free content is online? But maybe where you do need me is to guide you, to be that light on this journey we call life. Yeah. And that's where I come in, really. That's what I do.
All right, Morpheus. Now you're talking to Neo here, and Neo really appreciates all the tools and everything. And there's an element of this that one of the things we're starting to talk more about at Transcriptions is the off switch. And like the tools, what you just outlined there for those who are listening, like I've tried most of these things myself, and it's a great way to condense in the little time that you have a great workout and to really improve fitness. But going back to the off switch, right? Because sometimes the recovery equals the stimulus, or at least I've found that's worked in my own life a little bit. How are you measuring recovery? You mentioned a couple of biomarkers earlier, but also what are the things you're doing to help encourage people to do recovery? You mentioned ice bath for yourself. Not everybody's going to have the smooth, slick $5,000 ice bath in their house, right? It's going to be something a little bit different. So what are you encouraging the recovery side of life?
What I love about this question is that I'm a huge fan of trying to bring together ancestral wisdom, natural methodologies that are essentially free, don't cost anything. You can go outside and do certain things. And I like to pair that with modern technology, which we have if we so desire, or if we think we need it. If it's enough to jumpstart you into something else that gets you back to nature, then great, we've done it. And so, for instance, when it comes to, just as a direct example of what you pointed out, the ice bath. Before I got this fancy ice bath, I was just doing cold showers, right? Now, there's going to be people out there who go, yeah, but like cold showers don't really do it for me. But it's not nearly as cold as it should be and this and that. But did you try it though? Did you do it? Did you do it for a certain amount of time? And that goes back to those questions I like to ask. And so if you think you need a cold plunge, until you decide to pull the trigger and buy one, can you do a cold shower for 30 days every single day? Because then if you can't, then are you for me, I'm motivated by spending money on something.
Me too. I wanted to increase my zone 2 training, so I don't need a bike. I have a stationary bike right there, but I went out and bought a bike because it's nice outside. And so I'm one of those types of people as well. So guilty as charged. But yeah, for the others, there is the ice cold shower. So
yeah, so that's a really good start. Like an ice cold shower. Are you the type of person, because there will be a bunch of questions around that as well. I love to always make sure that when I say cold showers, people understand that it's actually a cold rinse, right?
Yeah, you're not sitting there the entire time.
I guess people do that, and that's perfectly fine. Like my buddy Salim Najjar, that HRV guy, I'm sure. I know him.
Salim and I, we know each other.
Yeah, he does just cold showers, right? Which is great. That's cool. I found that when I was doing cold showers, because obviously when I travel as much as I travel, I don't have access to my cold plunge every day, but I do have access to a shower, and I do have the capability of making it go as cold as it can go. And what I try to do is I make sure that for myself and anyone that I'm encouraging to do this, monitor how you feel when you're doing that. Are you the type of person that just instantly freezes, right? Do you anticipate that cold? How do you deal with that? Can you breathe through it? chances are how you deal with it or lack thereof is how you deal with life. It's a beautiful opportunity to go, okay. So you don't do cold showers. Got it. You might be resistant to anything else I'm going to suggest then.
Yeah.
Right?
Part of your
Most of the
intake
things
form to work with Josh Holland must be like, okay, do you take cold showers and are you resistant to it? And if not, then, or if so, then maybe not for us. Yeah.
Right. And then you might get someone that tells you, oh, I don't do cold. I'm more of a heat person. Okay. All right, great. So how often do you go outside? I don't go outside. I have a sauna. Oh, okay. So have you tried going outside? Because have you ever heard of grounding, which you've got a free sauna outside? Obviously, there's going to be restrictions to some people and depending on where they live, but why don't you combine some methodologies and modalities by just going outside, taking in the sunlight through the eyes at a certain time, which we've all heard of through the Hubermans of the world and whatnot, right? We've heard of all these things. But again, just because you've heard of it doesn't mean you've implemented it and doesn't mean that you've properly implemented it into your life to then make a judgment on it.
Yeah.
That's how I am. Don't just believe me. Go and try it for yourself. I'm not the expert here that says, I've done years of research and data on this, and I know this is going to work for you, and you've got to do it. No, I'm like, here's some things that I do. Here's some things in my toolkit. If you had a camera that panned into my room, you'd be like, why do you have all that stuff? I've got all kinds of stuff here, right? But the reason is because I like to try to find something that motivates me. Spending money on something motivates me, but then also creating content is a great motivator for me. Because if I'm working with a company and they say, we want to send you this product for free, or we want to give you this product at a heavy discount, I'm like, ooh, yeah, I like a discount. I got to create some content on it. I'm not going to create content if I haven't really vetted it. And so I need to be really adhering to the protocol so I know how to best talk about it. And depending on how a person who's watching or listening this, depending on what motivates you is the thing that's going to drive you into really getting motivated to get healthy. And so if that means being very natural, okay, grow your own food, great. Because don't tell me you are someone that doesn't want to get all these high-tech tools, yet you're ordering in from Uber Eats every night. Let's really get to the bottom of it. What is your resistance to these things? Are you really trying to be most natural? No problem. Here's a list of things you can do. Go walk after you eat. Meditate before you put a bit of food into your mouth. Can you identify the different flavors? Play a game with yourself. If you have a spouse or a friend that's cooking food for you, can you identify what are the spices that are in that food, right? These are not things that I'm going to say that you have to do, but it should be enough to create the awareness of what you're doing, right? If you have a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, that's one of the best ways to determine what the food you are putting into your mouth does to your biology, right? Now, do you need that? No. But is it a cool way to get you started? Because I promise you, if you do something like a CGM for a month or 2 months, then chances are, okay, exercise at this time of the day really is good for me, or endurance training is much better for me than strength training, whatever. You can determine based on your insulin, based on how high it's spiking and then how quickly it drops or it levels out. Like, these are things that we can use, right? It's technology, but it's also very natural too.
I love that in the sense that for me, and when I work with far less clients than you do, but when I work with a client, it's a lot of it's establishing that feedback loop, right? So how do you, and this is going to come back to our first point here, at your first pillar, how do you create that feedback loop so that the client becomes almost intuitively knowing what's good for them and what's bad for them, both in terms of movement, but also food, right? That can be done through CGMs. Like, I have more wearables than I can count. And a lot of that is, again, that experimental toolbox, which, second point I want to highlight you made there is that not one thing is going to work for everybody, but having that toolkit allows you to have that big reservoir. And this is why I love your approach of borrow what works and leave what doesn't, because you'll have a reservoir of things to draw from. And that reservoir allows you to be successful more often than not. So that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting because if a person is adverse to having wearables, because for me, to just be totally honest, in today's high-tech world, wearables is a really good way for me to work with someone and say, okay, if you're having problems sleeping, let's monitor it. And usually the person that doesn't sleep well is almost always the person who is adverse to wearing wearables. So it's okay. Then are you good at note taking? Okay, take out a notepad, get an old school pencil or pen, and write down how you feel. How did you feel when you went to bed? What did you do before you went to bed? You're establishing some kind of a feedback loop, right? And I just want to touch on this really quick because this conscious competence feedback loop is very important in what I do. Very important. And so for a person who's never really heard of it or doesn't understand it, if I'm working with someone and let's say I'm having them do an exercise, let's say I'm having them do a squat. If they're doing it incorrectly, then they start out with this unconscious incompetence situation, right? That basically means that they unconsciously are doing it wrong. They don't know they're doing it wrong. So something needs to trigger them into becoming consciously aware of what they're doing incorrectly. So once we can determine that, usually that is with a photo, a video, or me telling them what they're doing, right? And so now they become consciously incompetent. So now they know, oh, okay, let me make an adjustment now. So then they migrate over to consciously competent once we eventually get them to understand what they're doing, but they still have to think about it. So that means they're consciously competent to eventually they do it so many times that they become unconsciously competent. And that feedback loop is very important. I use it as a framework for everything I do, every single thing. So even with the celebrities I work with, I have loads of videos and photos in my phone. And sometimes if they're really sensitive, if it's a new client that I'm working with and they're not quite sure what I'm going to do with their likeness, then I'll take their phone, video them or take a photo and then show it to them. And that moment is very important. When they see it, it goes,
boom, light bulb.
Ah. So that is a very, very important point. Now, I forgot because I got off on a tangent there, but I know you asked a question about, because we were talking about the taking notes and not wearing wearables. What was that next piece?
So we talked a little bit about feedback loops, and then we also talked about the reservoir of information and tools that you draw from because of your diverse Renaissance man. Sorry, I'm going to use that term, background, right?
Yeah, it's important because just going into battle, if we think of life as a battle, that can be, for some people, that can be very morbid, very dark, very ugly, but it can also be exciting for some people. Some people really go at life.
Read Sun Tzu's Art of War, man. I read it when I was 12. It'll make you really excited for battle. Anyway.
Right, exactly. So if going into battle, would you as a person or as a soldier in battle, would you want to have more tools or less tools? Right? Now, you can get really crafty with that answer or that question and say, yeah, but you don't want to be weighed down with all these tools. But what I'm really getting at is having access to more tools. The more tools we have in the toolkit or in the toolbox, the better we're able to adapt to a certain situation. And sometimes those tools are innate. Breathing, learning how to regulate your nervous system. How important is that as a weapon? Right? If you're going into battle, the battle of life, and you show up at every opportunity, whether it's a business meeting, whether it's a first date with someone that you're really excited about, there's people out there like ourselves, like us, that are able to read someone based on how they come into a room. I'm really good at that. And if I see that a person is always spazzing out, I'm unconsciously, I just pull myself away from that person. And maybe I provide them an opportunity to let them know.
Send them from Glenn Block or something.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a really important point because it's a piece that I just pointed out that's a weapon that you have at your disposal that costs nothing. It takes time to understand that. That's not nothing, right? But it's essentially free in that you don't have to pay any money to have a tool. Now, if you want to get there quicker, maybe you do need a tool. Maybe you can get an Oura Ring or a Garmin Phoenix. Like I love these two devices I have on my body, despite the EMFs that come from it and things like that. I do enough practice in my life to mitigate EMF and to also make my cells more resilient to EMF because it's around us. But I love utilizing this, but I don't rely on it. I utilize it, but my day is not dependent upon what this information tells me. My day is dependent upon how I actually feel. And there's going to be times when I have to say, you know what, I'm just a little bit too wiped out. I can't accept this role, or I can't take on a new client. There's so many people pulling for me. One of the main things I remember distinctly from working with Dr. Ted, when I was going through some experiences with him, was that he witnessed tentacles, loads of tentacles within my aura, within my being, that were just pulling on me. And he did what he could using some interesting tactics to try to pull out those tentacles. And when we debriefed afterwards, he told me, hey, I want you to know that you're being asked to do a lot. You need to learn how to protect your energy. And he helped me to do that. And that's a powerful tool. That's like the ultimate power right there, is knowing when to be discerning and taking on projects and giving up my potential peace to work with someone or to work with something.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's in that case, it's like a therapeutic recognition of that there is this fear of missing out. And there's also worlds and worlds of people that depend on you already. And each endeavor, I think David Allen would have called it an open loop that you make in terms of creating a new project, is somebody who's drawing from you and your experience. And there's sometimes subconscious stressor there. And so one of the things that, again, your system helps do is bring awareness to those subconscious stressors. Now there's that conscious competence and the unconscious competence that you mentioned in terms of the feedback loop. Let's bring it all the way back to that awareness. And in certain cases, I'm just talking about myself here 7 years ago, or even in certain days, awareness can be fleeting, right? And being present is often hard to do, especially when you have a lot of pull on you. How are you training this in some of the busiest people in the world? Are you sitting down and saying, hey, let's meditate for 3 days, or let's go to an ashram in India? Or what's that kind of look like for you?
I think one of the main things is understanding what the time frame is. So if I'm on tour with someone like Roger or Madonna, or even working on a longer project with Oscar, I usually have an opportunity to set aside some time. And knowing that I can achieve the fitness piece with a shorter bit of time. So if I know that I want to spend an hour and a half with you, then what I'm going to try to do is do about 45 minutes of intense work. And then the remaining time, however much time that ends up being, will be about recovery, about talking. There's been so many times that I've worked with clients, even outside of the celebrities I work with, but they come to me frazzled. Maybe they had a fight with their spouse. Maybe they are under a harsh deadline at work or in school or whatever the case may be. I can usually tell. And so what good does it do for me to wipe you out so that you then stress more about that? So becoming aware of that and being honest about your situation will help me to help you best, period. And so it's really about talking to the person. We need to be able to communicate. When a person shuts off from me, it's hard for me to do what I do, really. Are you breathing through your mouth? Okay, I will encourage you. Again, it's that unconscious incompetence, right? Are you always breathing through your mouth whenever you're exerting yourself? Okay, maybe that's necessary, because if I've got you doing a bunch of burpees or I've got you doing sprints, at some point you're going to be breathing through your mouth, of course. When you're showing up or we're going through recovery and we're at the end of the workout, that's the point when you should be calming down your nervous system, reintroducing, because we need to be able to shift between sympathetic and parasympathetic well, right? It's that balance of being able to tap into it, especially as a tool, as a weapon. We need to be able to tap into it when the time calls for it. So whether it be exercise or actually running away from danger, we need to be able to tap into it, but we also, just as importantly, need to be able to down-regulate. Mm-hmm. And if I'm watching you always breathing through your mouth, I can't help but think, this person's stressed out. Mm-hmm. This person has adrenal overload. Okay, hey, let's practice breath work. And they might think I'm crazy because we're going to sit in there and breathing. But what I want to show them eventually is that you need to use this more so than you need to use me for a fitness trainer, because we can go and get a fitness trainer. Here's the thing that I definitely want to point out, especially to those who are watching, because I know you said we have a lot of clinicians watching, a lot of people who especially in my field, the field of training, fitness training, is very competitive, very competitive. And it makes this situation that we may not necessarily be aware of, but it makes it in a situation in which we become so competitive that we think that our way is the way. We touched on this earlier, right? But the moment that a person can relieve themselves from that and be willing to say, hey, I'm only here to get you to a certain point, and then I want to see you fly from the nest. That's a very powerful statement. And it's a very powerful confidence builder within yourself. And chances are you might find that the person that you're working with ends up wanting to work with you even more. And so if you're a clinician out there and you have all the best tools in the world, I would encourage you to be aware. Are you that person that is willing to say, hey, you know what? This clinician down the street is doing some stuff that I haven't really been experienced with, but I'm hearing some good results. Why don't you go and check them out? And that's very powerful, because if you're unwilling to do that, then that is the fear of missing out, so to speak. You don't want to miss out on that money, but it's not even just the money. It's the opportunity for someone to say, wow, Dr. Josh is willing to send me away to another trainer. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it.
It actually creates fear of missing out on their side too. So
there you go. There you go. Yeah. So I know I can get very tangential and I can go down so many rabbit holes, but that's what I love about doing podcasts and interact with people like yourself, is to be able to have conversation. And everything I'm saying may not be factual. It may not be the be all end all, but it is my experience.
And it's experimental too. And you've proven that with the feedback that you've gotten from your clients over the years, and they wouldn't keep hiring you if you didn't deliver the results. So Josh, I want to round out this conversation. Typical Josh Boomer conversation. This could go on for several hours, but in the interest of allowing you to get back to training those types of people, I want to talk about the role that barefoot and grounding, barefoot shoes plays in all of this. Because I suspect when I hear things like awareness, when I hear things like active movement, when I hear things like movement itself, like there's a role there. And how does that fit into this whole thing?
I'm very happy you asked this, because foot health happens to be one of my biggest focus points right now in my career. And what I find to be interesting is, so I just recently was in Dallas at the 10th annual biohacking conference, which was amazing because I got a chance to see some of the most talented, intelligent, experienced practitioners and methods and devices and tools. And there was one company that was talking about foot health, and that's Vivo Barefoot. And I have the great fortune of being able to work for the company, and I got an opportunity to speak on behalf of Vivo Barefoot at this amazing conference. But I just found it interesting that some people just don't even care about what happens with their feet. But wait a minute, this is what we are built upon. Our foundation is built upon our feet. And so if you're someone out there that has foot issues, I don't think it's wise to just expect it to go away because you put in an orthotic. Or I don't think it's wise to expect it to go away simply because you put on a barefoot shoe. We actually have to work it. And just like we have muscles in our biceps and muscles in our glutes, we've got loads of muscles, tendons, ligaments, bones in our feet that can atrophy if we don't use it. It's a use it or lose it process, right? So if we don't use it, or if we don't use it properly in the way that it was designed to be used, our foot is supposed to splay. And every time we splay, there are certain mechanisms that get activated based on that splay. And so depending on what issue you may have, like I used to have bunions really bad, and I wasn't born with bunions, and bunions weren't hereditary in my family, but I realize now that because I was playing basketball at such a high level, I thought that you're supposed to have an orthotic. I thought that you're supposed to wear a shoe size one or two sizes too small because it gave you more support. And looking back on that, I'm like, wow, that is so far from the truth. And I was still able to play at a very high level, but what ended up happening is I was asking my body to do something it wasn't designed to do. Therefore, the compensation pattern was that my feet in the toe box were being crowded, right? Because the shoe was too small and the toe box was not wide enough. And so my feet wanted to splay, but it couldn't. So it would splay in the way that it could. And so it was creating this bunion. And I was at a point at around 2007, 2008. I was here in New York. I was on the subway and I was seeing these advertisements on the subway about bunions. And I was like, yeah, bunions are gross. I thought bunions were for old grandmas.
Yeah, some people think of them as warts and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. And it didn't dawn on me until it started becoming painful. I was starting to get like some inflammation at the first metatarsal head of the big toe joint. And that's when I was thinking, oh, the advertisement's up there. We should probably go and get surgery. And that was when I met the folks at Vivo Barefoot. And it just happened to be at the right time. Serendipity kicked in. And I learned that you can actually do something called toe yoga or toga. And when I started doing that and I started to get myself in a more natural shoe, a shoe that is designed to allow the foot to do what it's supposed to do naturally versus a foot having to adapt to a conventional shoe, which just now doesn't make sense to me. Back then I didn't know. You don't know until, but that was when I was able to get myself out of having to go and get cut on. I want to keep myself from being on the cutting table as much as possible. And so I'm thankful that I was able to utilize the education from Vivo Barefoot to understand that we should be, there's three main criteria. And I'll leave this and then we could talk about something else. But the three main criteria for any type of footwear doesn't have to be Vivo Barefoot. But they do it right and they look cool and they've got a bunch of different uses for the shoes now. But the three main criteria is thin, wide, and flexible. And the reasons for that is so that, one, we need to be able to feel the ground, literally feel it. And we have so many sensory neurons in the bottom of the feet, almost as much as any other some of the major organs in the body. You're familiar with a homunculus, right? This homunculus model. Usually those are depicted to where the parts of the body that have the most sensory receptors are the biggest, right? And so you've got like the lips, the hands, the feet, the genitalia, right? These are some of the most dense sensory receptors in the body. Those are the things that need the most input. We need feedback there. If we don't, then things start to atrophy. And so those sensory neurons are directly connected to the brain. So if we're not getting certain feedback into those receptors, then our brain is dumbing down. And so every layer that we add to the bottom of a shoe just dumbs down that information, that sensory input. So when you can have a shoe that is thin, then you can literally feel the ground. Therefore, you can activate proprioceptors throughout the body. Your balance, your stability gets a lot better. For those who understand that falls happen to be the biggest detriment to our financial world today. I forget what the number is, but I want to say it's like $50 billion a year is devoted to falls. It can be life or death for certain populations. One of the main prevention tools for falls is stability through the toes. And then people hear that and they're like, what do you mean? We have devices that can measure your toe strength, but rather than get all that kind of fancy stuff, why don't you just, can you do your toes like this? I'm wiggling my toes in like this wave-like pattern. Can you do that? Can you lift all your toes up? Can you individually lift your big toe from your independent from the smaller toes and vice versa? Can you curl all your toes under and really challenge the flexion of the toe joints? Usually when a person does that, they cramp at their arch. When that happens, I know when it's going to happen. And my arch just cramped. It's because you finally activated the arch in a way that your body wasn't used to. And so that tells me we need to splay the toes more, because the more you splay your toes, the more you get into the plantar fascia. So understand, to be aware of, we should be focusing on our foot health as much as we focus on every other part of our body.
Amazing. Josh Holland, always a pleasure with you, my friend. I have to go do toga in honor of John Belushi and Animal House here. But I want to close things out with a question that we ask all of our guests, and always curious about your opinion here. And maybe you just answered it. What's one thing that you would recommend people institute in their lives to live smarter, not harder?
That's a really tough one because I want to give more than one. but I will honor your respectful question. I would say at this point in time, foot health.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I think focusing on foot health would really get you a lot farther down the road.
That's great. Where can people find out more about you, Josh?
Very easily, I'm on all social media platforms at Joshua J. Holland. So the Joshua, Joshua, the middle initial J, and then Holland, Holland. And you can find me on all major platforms. And feel free to check out my podcast, in which you've been a part of as well, Simply Walk the Talk. And feel free to DM me, hit me up, ask me questions. I want to connect.
Josh, always a pleasure. Can't wait to do it again in person. Now that I'm in the US, we can probably make it happen more frequently. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
To everybody listening, have a wonderfully epic and health optimized day. Rounding things off with Josh today, and wow, it's always fun for me to talk with Josh. I've spent a number of days with him in Amsterdam, and he's truly one of those people that practices what he preaches, sometimes to the detriment of the person that is selecting the restaurants, etc. But a couple of highlights from that episode for me is this experimental mindset / Renaissance man that Josh has developed, borrowing the pieces that we need from disparate fields sometimes and using them and leveraging them as part of this toolkit to help you in your goals. Number two is that conscious, what was the word he used? It was a conscious competence feedback loop. Those who work with clients, you'll know that feedback loops are incredibly important for everything that you do. Number three, of course, is awareness and how that comes into everything that we do and makes everything that we do more enjoyable, more present. We talk a little bit about equanimity here at SNH, and I can tell you, Josh certainly embodies that. If you want to find out more about the show, you can head on over to either transcriptions.com or Health Optimization Medicine Practice at homehope.org. You can smash the like button and please click subscribe or leave us a 5-star review wherever you are. We release these podcast episodes every single week, and it's really good to hear from people like yourselves as to what you enjoyed about the episode. So feel free to leave comments, and we look forward to staying health optimized and living smarter, not harder with you soon.